All right, next on our discussion of books of the Old Testament that deal with the issue of foreigners is the book of Ruth. Those are key concepts as usual. Big thing I'm going to focus in on is the idea or the purpose of the book of Ruth. What's it trying to communicate to us? Um, we know that the book of Ruth, we know the book of Ruth is set during the period of the Judges. So that's approximately 1200 to 1000 BC. But as was the case for the book of Esther, the book of Ruth is set in a completely different time period than it was actually written. And Ruth pretty much point blank tells us this when we look at Ruth chapter 4, verse 7. It says, "Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel." So today, the way we seal a deal is, well, it used to be with a handshake. Now it's with a fist bump or an elbow tap or a yelling of social distancing. But the way they signed a contract in ancient Israel was they traded shoes, apparently. That sounds really weird to us, and apparently it sounded really weird to the original audience of Ruth because the guy has to explain what's going on, meaning it's not common to the culture of the time. And he point blank says this was the custom in former times in Israel. So we know that it's written long after the story actually took place. So the question then is exactly when? Well, it's hard to pinpoint, but based on the language and style of Ruth and some of the issues that's presenting, we're comfortable saying it's what we call post-exilic. And this simply means that the book of Ruth was written after the end of the Babylonian exile, approximately during the period of Ezra and Nehemiah. Can't get a whole lot more specific than that. No clue who the author is, so we move right along. All right, just like Esther, we're going to evaluate the book of Ruth as though it is a story. We're going to approach it like it's a novella, like you would in an English lit class. So if you have not read the book of Ruth yet, do so now. The book of Ruth is a fairly easy, straightforward story. It's probably one of the easiest books in the whole Old Testament to read, so you can look at my little notes here to help you. All right, now that you've read the story of the book of Ruth, we want to see what the point of it is. Now let's just go ahead and skip right to the character analysis. Naomi usually comes across as sweet and wise to some people. Boaz, I want you to spend a moment analyzing him. Pause the video and think about him. Usually students come up with the impression that Boaz is a good person who is obedient to the law, and that's probably a fair reading of him. Is there anything negative we can really say about Boaz? Hard to come up with anything. Now Ruth is interesting. Most people think Ruth comes off pretty well in the story, and I would generally agree with that. Ruth comes across as this dear, sweet, innocent, obedient, faithful, loyal, all kinds of good words about her that you can throw in her direction. So the question then becomes: is there anything negative that we can really say about Ruth in this particular story? And the answer to that question is yes, there is something negative we can say about her, and it's that she's a Moabite. If you remember back to the lecture or over Ezra and Nehemiah, think about Tobiah the Ammonite. We kicked Tobiah the Ammonite out of the temple because he was one of those two types of foreigners that are especially hated according to the book of Deuteronomy. Ammonites and Moabites are not allowed to become part of the assembly of Israel up until and including to the 10th generation. Ruth, as a Moabite, should have absolutely positively no business becoming an Israelite. But she does become one. How does she do this? She does so by marrying Boaz. Now, the reason why she marries Boaz has to do with something known as the law of levirate marriage. This is also something that you will find in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 20. According to the law of levirate marriage, if a woman is married and he dies, his brother is obligated to marry her. So according to the law of levirate marriage, the next of kin of a husband who dies is obligated to marry his brother's original widow. And so Boaz is obedient to the law by marrying Ruth, by following the law of levirate marriage as prescribed in the book of Deuteronomy. But we have a problem here. Ruth's not actually allowed to get married to him if we follow the law perfectly and completely. And that may explain why the Israelite relative refuses to marry Ruth earlier in the story. So that brings up a question. Which of the two Israelites in the story obeys the law best, Boaz or the unnamed Israelite relative? The book of Ruth has set up a paradox for us. It shows us that there are times where it is impossible to perfectly keep the law. If Boaz marries Ruth, he breaks Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. If he doesn't marry her, then he is breaking the law of levirate marriage from Deuteronomy chapter 20. You cannot perfectly obey the book of Deuteronomy in this particular situation. One Israelite obeys one law, the other one obeys the other. And so the question becomes, which Israelite was correct in this particular story, Boaz or the unnamed one? Now there's a couple of clues in the book of Ruth that tell us what the author of Ruth thinks was the correct decision. The first one is from the names. Boaz gets a name. We know who he is. But the unnamed Israelite relative, well, he's unnamed. We have no clue what his name is. And so he's an easily forgettable character. So the book of Ruth hints to us right there that Boaz is the one in the right because he was obedient to the law very early on in the story by allowing Ruth to glean from the edges of the field, and he gets a name in the story. He is the memorable character. The definitive ultimate proof that Boaz was in the right, that he did the right thing and the unnamed Israelite did the wrong thing, comes at the very end of the book of Ruth when we find out that she becomes the great-grandmother of King David. And since a Moabite is not allowed to become part of the assembly of Israel up till the 10th generation, and Ruth is his great-grandmother, that means David was actually a Moabite. And so the author of the book of Ruth is daring to say to the Israelites who are divorcing their foreign wives, who are kicking Tobiah out of the Ammonite out of the temple, according to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the book of Ruth is daring to say to these people, hang on a second here. Is that really the best way to be obedient to the law? Maybe foreigners are not so bad after all. If David was good enough for you guys, and he was a Moabite, then why aren't all these other foreigners good enough for you guys? You should be willing to embrace foreigners just as you embraced Ruth, just as you embraced David's great-grandmother, just as you have embraced David himself. And so the point of the book of Ruth is very much written to sharply contrast with Ezra and Nehemiah, to show that being obedient to the law does not necessarily mean rigidly obedient in such a way that you're going to be harmful and hurtful to other people. And so maybe it's okay to be welcoming of foreigners. So we now have our fourth entry into the discussion of what is the relationship between Israelites and foreigners. Ruth gives us our first example of a positive portrayal of foreigners. That leaves us with one last entry, and that's going to be the book of Jonah, and that's what we'll turn to next time.